Good day to you once again, my listener. Welcome to our fifth episode on online logic and critical thinking. If this is your first time on this channel, please like, share, and subscribe for more updates from me. In this episode, we shall be discussing the concept of categorical proposition, its components, structures, and its importance to formal logic. If you recall, in our previous episode, we discussed the types of arguments. We also emphasized the importance of deductive arguments to formal logic, and for this reason, this episode thus becomes very important to our understanding of formal logic, as we shall delve more into deductive arguments. It is also good at this point that we remind ourselves that logic is simple. We just need to take it one step at a time. And so if there is anything you don't understand from my lessons, please use the comment box below, as I will be shedding more light on them in my subsequent episodes. Thank you. In our second episode in this channel, we'll discuss the concept of proposition in general. Having understood what arguments are, we shall go deeper into deductive argument through our understanding of categorical proposition, as this will further help us to understand categorical syllogism. Categorical syllogism is a more in-depth formal logic. Please stay tuned. If you recall in our definitions, we define the proposition as a statement that can either be true or false. It contains a subject, a predicate, and a copula. On the other hand, a categorical proposition is a statement that depicts the subject and predicate as classes of things and asserts or denies the relationship between the two classes or categories of things, or better put, of beings. A categorical proposition is an assertion about the relations among classes. If you check the word category itself, it means a class or a classification of a sort. So we can simply put, every categorical proposition says that a certain relationship exists between two classes. Categorical proposition has four components: the terms, the copula, the quality, and quantity. If you remember, in our notion of proposition, we say a proposition has three components. However, categorical proposition has four components, and the difference between them is the quality and quantity. The quality in a categorical proposition talks about the affirmative or negative character of a proposition, while the quantity refers to either some or all members of a particular class. We shall further explain this in the next slide. This is the structure of a categorical proposition. In this table, we have a standard four possible forms of propositions in formal logic. This implies that any proposition we come across in formal logic takes at least a form of any of these four propositions, and it's all about distinguishing between classes. To say something is universal, for instance, it implies an entirety of a class. In categorical proposition, the word all S are, every S are, or no S are denotes universal because they talk about an entirety of a class. However, while the word all S are or every S are regarded as affirmative in terms of their quality, the word no S is negative in terms of quality, which means it denies. On the other hand, when we talk about particular, we refer to individual or a few number of a class, which implies at least an entity of a class. In categorical proposition also, the word some S are, some S are not denotes particulars. However, while some S is affirmative in quality, the notion of some S are not is negative in quality. In a nutshell, the structure of a categorical proposition tells us that we have what we call universal and particular in terms of quantity, and we have affirmative and negative in terms of quality. So every quantity, which is universal or particular, universal has the tendency of being affirmative, as we earlier said, and particulars also have the tendency of being affirmative or negative. And these 4 forms are the forms which any proposition we come across in formal logic takes. To further explain the categorical proposition, we have what we call the universal affirmative, which is denoted by letter A. This is a proposition that affirms that all members of the subject class have the attributes of the predicate class. It has the form of all S are P. For example, all dogs are mammals. The second is the universal negative, which is denoted by letter E. This proposition denies that any member of the subject class has the attribute of the predicate class. It has the form no S are P. For example, no birds are mammals. The third is the particular affirmative, which says that a particular quantity has an affirmative quality, and is denoted by letter I. This proposition affirms that some members of the subject class have the attributes of the predicate class. It has the form some S are P. For example, some students are diligent. We have the fourth one, which is the particular negative, and it says that some particular quantity has a negative quality. This is denoted by letter O. This proposition denies that some members of the subject class have the attributes of the predicate. It has the form some S are not P. For example, some cars are not red. Let us take a look at some examples of our universal propositions, for instance. You remember that our universal propositions have affirmative quality and negative quality. So for the affirmative, we have always are mammals. A cat is a predator. Every president faces unexpected challenges. Each item on the menu must has a price. Any student using the gym must show an ID. A look at these affirmative propositions, we'll find out that they are universal affirmative propositions. And universal affirmative proposition says that it affirms that all members of the subject class have the attributes of the predicate class. And this is exactly what we have here. On the negative, we have just 3 examples. No dinosaur ate sushi. Not a creature was staring. None of the telephone is working. Our universal negative proposition denies that any member of the subject class has the attributes of the predicate. Let us also take a look at some examples of particular propositions. We also recall that particular propositions have both affirmative and negative in terms of their quality. And number 19 example, which is affirmative, says some apples are good for baking. If you look at this example, what it's saying is that some members of the subject class have the properties of the predicate class. The second example of affirmative particular proposition says a car is parked outside. This is talking about a particular car which is at least a member of the class of the subject has the properties of the predicate. On the negative, the example number 1 says some apples are not good for baking. A good look at this example says some members of the subject class do not have anything to do with the properties of the predicate class. And the same thing applies to number 22. It says a wire is not plugged in. A wire is not plugged in is talking about at least a member of the subject class which is wires and does not belong to the category or the properties of being plugged in. It is worthy to note that the concept of distribution in categorical proposition applies only to the terms. And when I say the terms, I mean the subject and predicate terms. For a term to be distributed, it must be the case that an assertion is made about every member of that particular class denoted by the term. And if this is not the case, it is undistributed. Let us take a look at proposition A, for instance, which is all S are P. If we represent this proposition with all dogs are mammals, we can see that an assertion is made about all dogs, which is the entire subject term. belonging to the category of mammals, which is the predicate term. But this proposition doesn't say that all mammals are dogs. And for this reason, we say in categorical proposition that the subject term is distributed and the predicate term is undistributed for universal affirmative propositions. A look at proposition E, no S are P. If we represent this with the proposition no birds are mammals, we will note that the subject and the predicate terms are distributed. Why? Because it says no category of the subject belongs to the category of the predicate, and this can also be vice versa. For instance, no birds are mammals will mean no mammals are birds. For this reason, we say both the subject and predicate terms of a universal negative propositions are distributed. For I propositions, some S are P. If we look at this critically, by the virtue of the quantifier some before the subject implies that the subject is already undistributed because it doesn't make claim to the entirety of the subject term. Likewise, the proposition does not imply that all P some S. For example, some students are diligent. This does not imply that all diligence to some students. For this reason, we say that in every I proposition, neither the subject nor the predicate is distributed. And for O propositions, some S are not P, we find out that P is distributed and the S is undistributed because it says likewise that some subject does not belong to the predicate term. This also implies that the predicate term doesn't belong to the subject. But while the notion of some makes the subject term undistributed, the predicate term distributed. In a nutshell, the above table shows the distribution status of all our categorical propositions. If you take a look at the examples in our distribution of categorical propositions, we'll find out that they are somehow related. And for this reason, let us look into the logical relationship between the categorical propositions. The first notable logical relation is the contraries. Contraries exist between two propositions and are only applicable to the A and E proposition. The notion of contraries implies that they cannot both be true together, but there is a possibility that they can be false together. In other words, if one contrary is true, the other must be false. But if one is false, the other can be either true or false. For example, if all bread is nutritious is true, then no bread is nutritious must be false because one is affirmative and the other is negative. And they cannot be true together because for them to be true together will be a kind of a contradiction. So for contraries, they cannot be true together, but they can be false together. Just like the contraries, the subcontraries refer to the logical relationship between two particular propositions, I and O. One is affirmative while the other is negative. I and O propositions cannot be true together, neither can they be false together because they are mutually exclusive statements. If one is true, the other must be false. For example, if some cats are black is true, then some cats are not black must be false, and vice versa. Contradictories are part of the logical relations in categorical propositions. Contradictories are a specific type of relationship that can exist between two propositions. Two propositions are said to be contradictories when they have opposite truth value, such that if one is true, the other must be false, and if one is false, the other must be true. In categorical propositions, the O proposition and A proposition have opposing truth value. For instance, if we hold the proposition some bread is not nutritious to be true, it is thus contradictory to hold true of the proposition that all bread is nutritious. Likewise, the E proposition and the I proposition are also contradictories because they have opposite true values. For instance, if we hold that no bread is nutritious to be true, then the proposition that some bread are nutritious will definitely be false because it's a contradictory. You can't say no bread is nutritious and at the same time say some bread are nutritious. The last of the logical relation in categorical proposition is the subalternate. The term subalternate refers to the logical relationship between the universal proposition and its corresponding particular proposition. For instance, the I proposition is called subalternate to A because the truth of A implies the truth of I proposition. but it's not vice versa. The truth of I proposition does not necessarily imply the truth of A proposition. The same applies to O proposition as being subordinate to E proposition. The universal one always implies the particular, but not vice versa. This is a traditional square of opposition showing the logical relations in the four categorical propositions. This diagram, however, illustrates these relations and helps us to understand better the relationship between the categorical propositions. Now that we've discussed the notion of categorical propositions in general, we shall go deeper into the categorical propositions by illustrating them in our Venn diagram, and this we are going to do in our next episode. Thank you.